As a watertight means of measuring star power, the introduction of the pay-per-view model back in 1981 was an instant game-changer. With each athlete's promotional angle now irreversibly tied to their earnings, the pay-per-view era has been one that has seen a major upsurge in the dramatization of rivalries, with fighters often feeling the need to truly sell their feuds, no matter how genuine they actually are. Though largely dominated by boxing and its premier pay-per-view draws, this list certainly does validate some of the momentum that has undoubtedly been behind MMA in the last decade or so, making for a mixed bag of old and new. So with that being said, here are the top 10 pay-per-view buys in sports history. Number 10. Mike Tyson vs. Evander Holyfield 1.59 million buys. As a fight that was many years in the making, it was somewhat unfortunate that these two icons didn't clash earlier on in their careers. As we all know, however, Tyson's boisterous nature led him down many a dark path, something that threw his prospects as a boxer off course more than once. When November of 1996 did come around, the fight with Holyfield stood as Tyson's first defense of his newly recaptured WBA belt, just his fifth outing since his 4-year hiatus from the sport due to his incarceration. Holyfield, though a known commodity, was billed as the underdog going in. But as soon as the fight started, it became clear that he had been waiting for this matchup for years. Armed with the perfect game plan to disrupt the comparatively rigid Tyson, Holyfield took Iron Mike's best shots and thoroughly outboxed him from first bell to the last. It was a huge shock for those fans who had been waiting to see the Tyson of old regain his form. But with an 11th round TKO, it truly was Holyfield who put his name on the map that night. Number 9. UFC 100. Brock Lesnar vs. Frank Mir 2. 1.6 million buys. Brock Lesnar's success within the sport of MMA did catch quite a few people off guard. Sure, the hulking behemoth looked the part, but given his relative lack of experience, aside from an NCAA Division I background, seeing him defeat veterans of the sport was truly shocking. In just his second MMA fight, Lesnar was thrown into the deep end in every sense of the word when he was paired up with the former heavyweight champion, Frank Mir. Despite starting very strongly, Mir would eventually lock up a knee bar submission, tapping the WWE superstar, leaving him with his first loss. Now, with Brock in possession of the heavyweight title and Mir returning to face him as the challenger, all of a sudden, fans were faced with a matchup that had everything: history, fresh intrigue, the biggest prize in the sport on the line. Except this time, Brock Lesnar was better prepared, more experienced, and as a result, he was able to score a finish in the second round by way of TKO. UFC 100 was a milestone event for the company, and with a star-studded lineup that included both Jon Jones and Georges St. Pierre, it's no surprise that this event ranks among the highest-grossing PPVs of all time. Number 8. UFC 202. Nate Diaz vs. Conor McGregor 2. 1.65 million buys. UFC 202's welterweight headliner was a high-stakes rematch with some very real consequences. Conor McGregor had just suffered his first defeat as a UFC fighter, a loss that came at the hands of the meandering veteran Nate Diaz. For the Stockton-born brawler, this win stood as a well-deserved moment of triumph and widespread recognition of his talents. The weaknesses that were exposed by Nate the first time around were now there for the world to see. The size, the stamina, the indestructible chin that would just not be cracked. Something needed to change in the rematch, and change it did. The resulting fight saw a better prepared McGregor attempting to break Diaz relentlessly once again, before an almighty momentum switch saw things descend into beautiful, beautiful chaos. In the end, Conor did enough to take home 3 rounds in the eyes of the judges cage side, but in reality, both men came away with a moral victory. A classic fight that delivered on every possible level, and thankfully, it was one of the most watched UFC events of all time. Number 7. Lennox Lewis vs. Mike Tyson. 1.97 million buys. An ugly pre-fight press conference brawl almost robbed us of the opportunity to see these veteran superstars collide. But in the end, the fight went ahead on June 8, 2002. Though considered by most to be past his best, Tyson was still a fearsome knockout artist within the heavyweight division. And in Lennox Lewis, he had the perfect dance partner. Lewis had certainly had his own mountains to climb over his numerous years at the top, but after avenging both of his career losses, the undisputed champ was clearly the favorite. The first round was certainly the most exhilarating display of high-octane boxing of the lot. The pair collided in a show of furious pace and aggression, with Iron Mike getting an early upper hand. From there, though, the class and fundamentals of Lewis proved too much, as he navigated through treacherous waters on his way to an 8th-round KO victory. It would stand as the final major blockbuster of each man's career. Number 6. Evander Holyfield versus Mike Tyson 2. 1.99 million buys. As you would expect, an immediate rematch between Evander Holyfield and Mike Tyson was booked the following year. The original bout was one of the biggest boxing events of all time, and while the fight itself wasn't as competitive as most would like, these two as an item clearly worked, and so a second helping was set up for June of 1998. Tyson, who had been beaten pretty handily the first time around, cut a far more aggressive, and in many ways, agitated figure in the rematch. Once again, it was Holyfield who started strong, seizing control of the fight in the opening rounds. As we all know, things got very ugly shortly after, when Iron Mike bit a chunk of Holyfield's left ear off in the middle of a momentary pause in the clinch. After being docked 2 points, though allowed to continue, Tyson did the exact same thing to Holyfield's right ear, bringing the fight to a shocking conclusion with DQ loss for the former champion. A sad day for blockbuster combat sports events, and unfortunately, one that was watched live by a huge audience, making it one of the biggest fights of the 1990s. Number 5. Floyd Mayweather versus Saul Canelo Alvarez. 2.2 million buys. Canelo Alvarez is a bona fide superstar in his home country of Mexico and beyond. Floyd Mayweather was the king of the pay-per-view medium at the time. How on earth could this ever fail? Though Floyd made sure to take every possible advantage in making the larger man cut down to a catch weight of 152 pounds in order to truly make Alvarez work for this opportunity. For Canelo, it was an excellent learning experience and opportunity to go in there with perhaps the greatest pure boxer of all time. But at 23 years old, he lacked the refinement to trouble Floyd in the slightest bit. Mayweather was able to control the comparatively limited Canelo once the middle rounds had passed by, and despite one hugely questionable scorecard that called the fight a draw, Floyd was declared the victor. Number 3. Oscar De La Hoya versus Floyd Mayweather. 2.4 million buys. In joint third place comes Floyd Mayweather's last true fight as the B-side, the fight that saw him make his final walk to the ring as Pretty Boy Floyd before donning the Money moniker. Oscar De La Hoya was a hero to the people, an Olympic gold medalist who achieved huge success across multiple divisions in the professional game. The Golden Boy was the perfect counter to the increasingly brash and braggadocious Mayweather, who taunted him relentlessly during the pre-fight buildup. As you would expect, anticipation levels went through the roof by the time these two were ready to settle their differences. The bout itself was an entertaining affair, all things considered, but as the middle rounds approached, as is the case with most Mayweather fights, Floyd began to truly take over. In the end, despite another controversial scorecard in favor of De La Hoya, Mayweather earned himself the biggest victory of his career up to that point, and the rest, as they say, was history. Number 3. UFC 229, Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Conor McGregor. 2.4 million buys. Coming in as the second of our 2 third-placed entries is the culmination of one of the most genuinely vicious feuds we've ever seen in combat sports. The rivalry that existed, and in many ways still exists, between Khabib Nurmagomedov and Conor McGregor was one that crossed many lines, ranging from religion to sporting ethics. As the highest-selling mixed martial arts event of all time by a considerable distance, it was clear that this fight had broken through to the mainstream in a way that no other bout had done up until that point. The fight itself, a dominant effort by the Dagestani lightweight king, was secondary to the sheer venom that was to be found between these global icons. When the fighting stopped and Khabib jumped over the side of the octagon in one moment of pure madness, it only served to heighten the entire spectacle. With both men still fighting and currently in the win column, it's not completely outside of the realms of possibility that a rematch happens next year. It's that a second helping would have a strong possibility of outperforming the first, and that's saying something. Number 2. Floyd Mayweather versus Conor McGregor. 4.3 million buys. The Notorious One makes yet another appearance in this top 10, this time alongside combat sports' biggest draw, Floyd Mayweather. The money fight, as they dubbed it, was the crossover matchup to end all crossover matchups. The biggest star in boxing versus the biggest star in mixed martial arts. Those who understood what they were ordering knew that very little would be solved, and yet, looking back on it now, none of us were able to resist what these guys brought to the table. When the action actually got underway inside the ring, McGregor's spirited effort truly did make this one a win for both parties. Sure, Floyd, being a far superior pugilist, was able to avoid all danger early on before taking complete control in the later rounds. But this fight wasn't about the competition so much as it was about the sheer madness of seeing these guys throwing punches in close quarters. That and the fact that each man used this undeniable circus to take home 9-figure checks. But hey, the game is there to be played. Number 1. Floyd Mayweather versus Manny Pacquiao. 4.6 million buys. And finally, the highest selling pay-per-view in the history of sports, the 2015 matchup between Floyd Mayweather and Manny Pacquiao. A fight that was years in the making, and to be honest, one that likely arrived a few years too late. Money Mayweather has always been a genius when it comes to picking fights at the right time for himself from a business standpoint, minimizing risk, maximizing profits, and finding that sweet spot in between. When this fight finally did happen, an older Manny Pacquiao struggled to break down the watertight defense of the legendary unbeaten champion, leaving the fight as something of a dud in the eyes of the fans. Those who were familiar with Mayweather's career saw this coming from a mile off, allowing them to at least marvel at Floyd's technical mastery as he thoroughly shut Manny down. All in all, not a barn burner many had hoped for, but even still, Mayweather-Pacquiao remains an event of major significance and will likely be the highest selling pay-per-view of all time for quite a bit longer. It will take something truly special to knock this one off the top.